Good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Adamson. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this kick-off event of the new EU-UK Forum. As you will probably have seen from the mission statement, the Forum aims to facilitate and nurture a constructive and informed dialogue between the UK and its European neighbours, whatever the outcome of the current negotiations. It is non-partisan and designed to be a platform for discussion, debate, and information exchange. And with that in mind, we will very much welcome your insights, your expertise, and your ideas. Today's event will set the scene for the future activities of the Forum. First, there will be a presentation by Kelly Beaver, Managing Director of Public Affairs at Ipsos Mori, on some new research conducted for the EU-UK Forum on Great Britain's position and influence in the world, and specifically its future relationship with the European Union. And her slides will be available after the event on the Ipsos Mori website and the EU-UK Forum website. We will then ask David Lidington, the UK's former and long-standing Minister for Europe, to react to these findings. He and I will then have a conversation about ways in which the UK and the EU could and should cooperate in the future. But I will not monopolize David entirely, because we want to hear from you. You will see that chat function at the bottom of your screen, which you should use if you want to ask a question of David or Kelly, or simply want to make a comment. And I will do my best to include as many as possible in the time we have. But without further ado, let me hand over to Kelly. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Share my screen with you. So firstly, only 10 months ago, Brexit, Europe, the EU was all the British public were thinking about. It was a key issue that Boris Johnson and the Conservatives campaigned over in the run-up to the general election in 2019. Over half of the British population said that this was the key issue that would determine their vote. All eyes were on Brexit. And you would have been forgiven to think that this year would have all been about the transition year between this point and actual Brexit. But December was a lifetime ago, and it will not have escaped anybody's notice that the key issue in the British public's mind for the majority of this year, certainly since March, has been the coronavirus pandemic. And that is everything from conversations around whether you will tell on your neighbour, whether you must stay at home, and whether you're clapping for honour for the NHS. That has been the key conversation topics since March this year. And we look at how the public feel and what they're worried about through two different mechanisms. One is through proactive social media analytics. And just Kelly, have a look at these trends.
Can I interrupt you? Are you going to share your screen later or now? Just to make sure we can see your slides.
You should be able to see them, Paul. Let me just make that possible. Share. Apologies.
No problem at all.
This is the social media analytics, and you can see just some of the lower order topics that people have predominantly been posting on: the economy, crime, environment. And just have a look here at the peak that we saw in and around March, April time, where the public were predominantly posting and talking about coronavirus. But then have a look at the Brexit conversations, and they really fell off a cliff at the end of December, early January, and have been much of a lower order conversation in proactive social media posts. But Ipsos Mori has been tracking for over 50 years some of the key issues and the most important issues that the public think are facing Britain today. And this is a chart that shows you every single month in a line chart since September 2010. And let's just pick out two of them. So coronavirus pandemic obviously was a non-issue. It's what they call a black swan event, once in a lifetime, but it has certainly taken over what the public are thinking about. And again, Brexit, and you just see in and around the general election where it peaked and the run up to from 2016 and the referendum vote where it rose steadily. It really did fall off a cliff in March, and it has only started to pick up in the last month. But it is interesting that it has started to pick up as we run into the last few months of the negotiations. And it's not just the public that are thinking about Brexit, it's also Europe, the UK's business leaders. And whilst again, coronavirus and the pandemic effects are certainly front and centre of mind, with almost 9 in 10 British businesses in our Captains of Industry study stating that that is the most important issue facing Britain today, Brexit uncertainty makes it in second place, and it is still very important and is likely to rise over the months ahead. And they believe businesses, 2/3 of business leaders believe that the successful handling of the transition period is absolutely vital to their business. So it is clear that whilst the pandemic has really taken over in terms of what public are predominantly worried about since March, it is now Brexit is really coming back into the fore and being second in the public's mind and rising. But what do Britons want from the relationship with the EU? Well, they want a close relationship, and that's clear from the data that we collected alongside Paul and his team. 4 in 5 still think it'll be really important for Britain to maintain a close relationship with the EU after Brexit. And it doesn't really matter which part of the political spectrum you sit in. The majority, whether you're Conservative, Labour, Leave or Remain, the majorities in all of those would still say that they believe it's important to have that close relationship. And what is the top priority for the British public in that relationship? Well, it's no surprise that it's trade. Trade 4 in 10 say that trade is the most important priority as we go into the negotiations in the winter period. But also beneath that, there are some second order priorities that warrant attention. Crime and terrorism, they see that as a key part of the relationship. And then also there are a number of areas where the British public believe it will be important to cooperate with Europe because of the importance at an overall world level. So 2 issues, climate change and also the coronavirus pandemic. And they believe it's important that we cooperate with Europe and we work closely with them on those issues. And again, when we look at this by whether people voted Remain or whether they voted Leave in the 2016 referendum, there's not really much difference in terms of what people perceive as the key priorities for Britain's future relationship with the EU. But there is one predominant and important issue, and the Leave voters are much more likely than Remain to state that working with the EU to reduce illegal immigration into Britain is their top priority. It's only 11% of Remainers who believe that that should be a priority for Britain in the coming years. And business leaders, the answer for them around priorities is very simple. It's 2 things that are top priority: frictionless trade and freedom of movement and access to that skilled labour. They come out very highly. So it's clear that public are caring about this relationship with the EU and they want a close relationship with the EU. But actually, from the data that we've just collected in September, it's clear that hopes for that positive negotiation outcome are fading. 4 in 5 say they want a close relationship between Britain and the EU, but only 2 in 5 now think that that is likely. And that is down from a majority last year, where we had over half of people telling us that they thought it was likely that we'd be able to maintain that close relationship. And there are differences here between how people perceive that relationship and the likelihood of it being close. So if you are a Conservative voter or a Leave voter, you are more likely to believe that it is possible for that relationship to maintain a close proximity. But actually, if you are Labour and Remain, you are less likely to think that's the case. And when we look at how they perceive Boris Johnson's ability to get a good deal, looking at the top level result here doesn't really do it justice. So it's, yes, 2 in 5 think that Boris Johnson will get a good deal for Britain, but actually that is served very well by the Conservative voters' view of Boris Johnson, where it's 3/4 of them believe that he has the potential to get a good deal in the negotiations, and a very low proportion of Labour voters think that's the case. And we've asked this question of the public about whether or not they think the government has done a bad job preparing, a good or a bad job preparing for a no-deal Brexit. And 6 in 10, that's the majority, believe that the government has done a bad job. And whilst that might feel quite negative, actually that is an improvement on where it sat in either February or May when we asked the same question, where it was as many as 8 in 10. And again, this is being impacted by that Conservative voter view of how Boris Johnson is performing in the negotiations, which I showed you a moment ago. And if things do go badly, who would the public blame? It's actually quite split. So it's around 44% who would blame the UK government, but 40% would blame the EU. So it's not particularly clear that the blame would fall on one part or the other. And business leaders have an understanding that the end of the negotiations in December may not be the end of negotiations and that this is part of a process. They perceive that actually, even if negotiations reach some kind of outcome by December, that it is likely that it may not cover all sectors for trade, it may cover some. And also over a third think that actually the negotiations and the transition period itself might be extended. Only 1 in 10 believing that the UK will exit without a deal. What impact do we think that leaving the EU will have on the UK? So 2 in 5 think it will make the UK less secure. And actually over the next 5 to 10 years, we see that the most negative impact the British public are worried about is on the economy, followed by defence and security. Interestingly, it is very much more concerned around the national level issues. When you ask people about the extent to which it will impact on their own life, the biggest groups say that it will make no difference to their day-to-day lives, but it will make an impact, and more majorities thinking that it will make a negative impact on things like the economy and defence and security. And this is a key slide, actually. So nearly half people believe that leaving the EU will reduce Britain's influence in the world, and this has risen since the same question was asked in April 2019. So over the last period of time, this has increased. Business leaders are clear that there are some benefits to Britain leaving the EU, and they do think that some things will get better. Predominantly the UK's government ability to focus on industrial policy relevant to Britain, and also be able to have free trade negotiations with major non-EU countries. They are clear, though, that there are some negatives as well, particularly around the prices for consumers in the UK, and also the ability to recruit skilled staff. So with all of these perceptions shifting over the last period, certainly since April 2019, where we last looked at it, our perception of Britain in the world is shifting. And it's not that British people want to be isolationist or indeed not having a strong role in the world. In fact, the majority still say that they think that Britain is a force for good in the world, but that has declined since April 2019. And again, a higher proportion believe that Britain should try to punch above its weight in world affairs, but the amount that disagree with that has increased actually since April 19. So there are a whole range of things here where we have seen a shift in how people are perceiving Britain's influence. And here again, you see that people believe that there should be an increase in Britain's influence in the world, but that has declined. So still, whilst the majority would say that, it has declined. Ultimately, 2 in 5 Britons still say Europe is the most important relationship when asked about a range of other countries and collections of countries. So if you're a young person, there's a divide here. So if you're a young person, you're more likely to say Europe. If you're an older person, you're more likely to associate with the Commonwealth. And so more older people do classify into that category. But ultimately, 2 in 5 Britons still say Europe is the most important relationship for them. So in summary, public concern about Brexit is rising. It did fall off a bit of a cliff this year given the coronavirus pandemic, but it is rising again. But those views of a likelihood that the outcome will be positive from the negotiations, they're declining. Getting some things right are really important to not just the British public, but also businesses. So trade and security cooperation is absolutely critical for them, but also the ability to collaborate with the EU on major world problems like the COVID pandemic and also climate change are of importance. And Britons don't want to withdraw from global affairs or be isolationist. There is a shift in some of those numbers that I showed you just now, but they still have the majority, a higher group of people stating that they see Britain as an important force for good in the world. And most people, higher proportions, are saying that they believe that the EU is still the most important relationship, and also they have a real want to have a close relationship with the EU. 4 out of 5 say that's important moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. That was tremendous. I'm going to pass the floor in a second to David to get his reaction to your presentation, but I'll, as moderator, use my position to ask you one quick question on my side, which is about generations, of course. I think all the analyses after 2016 referendum took place showed that up to about the age of 45 or whatever, there was a pretty clear pro-Remain majority in those different age groups, 18 to 45 roughly. And beyond that, after 45, then a Leave majority kicked in, obviously. So, 4 years plus on, how do you think these figures now would demonstrate the age gap as well?
Sure, Paul. So it's, you cannot deny at the minute that age is a really key determinant of how people are voting. And when we look at some of the slides that I've just shown you and some of the issues, age is very much linked to Remain, very much linked to Labour. And so when I did those splits, you could almost do a proxy for young people are more likely to think something. So in particular, young people are more pessimistic that Boris Johnson is going to get a good deal. They think that some of the priorities are slightly different for young people as well. So they think that as well as trade's important, they're more interested in democracy as well, human rights, refugee crisis, etc. And ultimately, the young people are more likely to believe that Britain's influence in the world has been negatively impacted as a result of Brexit. So there are strong age divides. It's the same with everything in terms of a vote at the minute, just because it is such a key determinant.
Okay. Well, thank you. I should not monopolize you any further. I'm going to bring in David now. I see there are already questions coming in, actually addressed maybe to Kelly and to David, but let's bring David in. Before you and I start chatting, David, which I'm very much looking forward to our conversation, can I ask you first to give your first reaction to Kelly's findings?
I think Kelly's findings, bear out what I think had been my gut instinct, which is that people, whether they voted Leave or Remain in 2016, do, for the most part, want to see a friendly and constructive relationship between the United Kingdom and our fellow European democracies in the EU in the years to come. And I can remember many, many doorsteps I knocked on in 2016 when I was campaigning for Remain, and getting an answer along the lines of, well, I wanted a single market, but I really don't want a political union. And I think a lot of Leave voters made their judgment on the basis that political integration had gone too far, and they had particular concerns at things like the limits on national immigration policy that the free movement of people principle required, and said, look, we need to have more national independence, but actually, I do want to do business with these countries. I want to maintain friendly relationships with these countries and work with them on a different basis. And I think those of us who voted and campaigned for Remain, have to move on from 2016. And however many times you replay the tape, Paul, that our side still lost. And it's important, I think, we focus on what kind of relationship do we want to see develop over the next 5, 10, 15 years between ourselves and other democracies, where cooperation between us is going to be of demonstrable mutual advantage at a time when the Western liberal democratic model is being increasingly challenged both by Putin and by Xi.
Right. Okay. I take the hint, David. But the forum is all very much about the future and not looking at the past. But let me at least ask you to give a quick snapshot about the present. Where do you think the current negotiations stand, and what do you think is the most likely outcome?
I have consistently, despite all the pessimistic noises, remained of the view that a deal is more likely than no deal. I think that the reasons for trying to get a deal are twofold. Threefold actually for the UK point of view. One is, and this applies to EU as well as to us, there's a clear economic commercial advantage in limiting the disruption to established just-in-time tariff free, friction-free trading relationships. There's going to be some. It'll be a big noticeable difference, even with the sort of deal that the government's talking about now. But a no deal would be worse, and that's not in anybody's interest. Secondly, a deal provides the basis for going forward to have future discussions, getting the new relationship off on the right sort of footing rather than an acrimonious, bitter separation. And third, from the UK point of view, I think if you're a unionist government at Westminster, the last thing you want is to gift to the Scottish National Party almost the ideal campaigning issue of a no-deal crash out of the European Union. There's two issues. basically that remain to be thrashed out. One is state aid and the other is fish. On state aid, if there's political will, there can be a compromise, it seems to me. I think the EU's got to move away from the idea of dynamic alignment, so that you're expecting the UK always to follow whatever the EU does in the future on state aid and standards. But I think equally the UK has to compromise, and I think you're looking there at some kind of binding non-regression clauses from certain sort of current environmental employment standards, and an independent arbitration mechanism to resolve disputes along the lines you have in free trade agreements all around the world. And then on fisheries, again, if there's the political will, it's probably the compromise is a sort of transitional arrangement, so that you gradually sort of limit any grandfather rights or safeguards that EU fishing fleets currently have. And you perhaps also put some limit on what British fishermen can do in selling off their quota rights to EU fishermen, because a lot of that's been going on, which is one reason why Spanish or French owned vessels are scooping up so much fish in British waters, because a lot of British fishermen in the past have sold their quota on to those Spanish and French operators. So I think the deal can be done. I think there's a landing zone there. But my worry is that we have so little time left. The deal, if there is one, has to go through the European Parliament for approval, as well as be approved by the European Council. It's obviously you've got to turn a negotiated agreement into a precise legal text that the lawyers have been through, that has the same legal meaning in each of the EU's working languages. So you've got this complex process of the language legal experts going through it all. So yeah, that is my biggest worry, that we just run out of time and hit the buffers, even though nobody, I think, really wants a no deal to happen.
Okay, but even with the simplest of deals, if there is a deal, it means that there'll still be quite a lot of unfinished business. And one of Kelly's slides when business leaders confirmed that. So, in your view, where would you think the most pressing issues to be addressed would be after the end of the transition?
There's a number, and obviously, if there is a deal, it is possible that would then be accompanied by some side deals that would obviate the need for further work in January. But if these have not been achieved by January, I think with COVID raging, I think some sort of agreement over mutual recognition, even if only for a time-limited period, of pharmaceutical and medical appliance standards seems to me to be essential, so you don't get drugs and medical equipment held up going through all sorts of form filling and checks. Secondly, data equivalence. I would hope that if there's a deal, the EU will agree that the UK system has data equivalence with theirs. But if we don't get data equivalence sorted out, that's going to cause very real difficulties for an awful lot of firms. Third would be equivalence in financial services. Again, this is a unilateral EU decision. It's not a negotiation. And there's a lot of politics involved in that. And of course, the commissioner, assuming she is confirmed, which I expect her to be, who will take that decision, will be the new Irish Commissioner, Mairead McGuinness, who has for many years in the European Parliament represented all the border counties in the Republic of Ireland. So, you can see immediately how the politics is inevitably going to get mixed up with the technical assessment of financial services equivalence. But that is really important, not just for London, but for Edinburgh, for Leeds, for Manchester, for so many parts of the UK. And I would add to that one more as in terms of urgent priorities for January onwards, which would be a veterinary agreement. Even if we get zero tariff, zero quotas, there will be a requirement for veterinary checks, for phytosanitary checks to take place at the border of the EU and of the UK on livestock, on meat, on some other food product. If you get a veterinary agreement, that can cut out the need for quite a lot of that red tape. New Zealand has a deal with the EU on veterinary practices, and that means that only a relatively small fraction of New Zealand's admittedly limited imports of livestock into the EU are actually subject to those tests. We need the same.
Okay. Thank you. So in all these areas you've highlighted to be discussed after the end of transition, do there have to be new formal structures created for these negotiations to take place?
Yes, I mean, I think I mean, some of them, financial services equivalence and data equivalence decisions, are unilateral EU decisions. We can ask for them, and then the EU decides whether or not to grant them. For some of the other elements, so a veterinary treaty, new arrangements on police and criminal justice cooperation, which is something I would argue we really do need in the fight against terrorism and serious and organised crime. So in order to give us access to some of the EU's databases and for them to have access to some of our information, those need a legal structure, and yes, those will need almost certainly a mandate from EU ministers meeting in the European Council to an appointed negotiator. It could be Barnier. He may maybe get fed up after this year. So it could be somebody else. It could be the relevant commissioner. Act then on behalf of the council, following the council's unanimously agreed mandate, and there would have to be a UK structure there. So I think there will need to be that negotiation. And if there's no deal, I mean, that is not a destination. That would be, in the Prime Minister's words, a failure of statecraft. And what one would then need to do is carry on trying to get agreement in time on a trade agreement, on a police and criminal justice agreement, and so on. So we're going to need that structure anyway. The other thing, if I may, Paul, I will just pitch in on, though, is that one of the things that will be noticeable from the end of this year, but actually it started from the 31st of January this year, is that UK ministers no longer bump into French or German or Dutch or Italian counterparts at European Council meetings. When I was in government, I would be in Brussels or in Luxembourg pretty much every month except August. And I'd not only have the formal council meeting, but I'd be hobnobbing with my opposite numbers in other countries, and I'd have a list always of the issues I needed to raise with them affecting various government policies and government objectives. Not just EU ones, but something where perhaps we wanted them to do something in the UN, or we wanted to get their support for something apropos Russia. You lose those opportunities, so we're going to have to think very hard and act quickly in trying to put in place a structured set of relationships with some of these other countries. We have an annual summit, for example, with France. Yeah. Well, are we going to need something similar with Germany? Do we need to think about joint cabinet meetings with some of the major players in Europe once a year? I think it's going to be really important. If we're going to sustain these relationships, we'll need to have the formal diplomatic structures to underpin that.
Okay. What I'm going to do, David, is go back and forth from the chat function, because there are a number of questions coming in. It seems unfair to people asking questions to have to wait until you and I have finished chatting. So I'll take some questions now from the audience and then come back. So one question from David Eads of the BBC. What is your view, David, on the UK-Japan trade deal? And what does it tell us about the opportunities out there in trading with the rest of the world?
Oh, it's certainly welcome. I mean, most of it amounts to a rollover of the EU's existing trading relationship with Japan's trade deal with Japan, of which we were, of course, a part and remain a part while we're in the transitional period. In some respects, in some of the data and other aspects, there are some additional elements that benefit the UK. I think that in some of the other stuff, or some of the agricultural stuff, I think it rose back a bit from EU Japan, but I think probably it seems to be a reasonable adjustment of the detail to tailor it a bit more to UK interests. I'm all in favour of pushing ahead with trade deals with as many countries as possible around the world, but we shouldn't kid ourselves. In the government's own assessment is that even if we were able to get FTAs with all the countries that we have been talking about and highlighting, then it would still boost our GP by a much smaller version than what we would stand to lose through leaving the EU. So it can offset some of this, but it doesn't take away the challenge that leaving the EU presents to us, and therefore, in my view, we also need to continue to work for the smoothest possible trading relationship with the EU in the future. And we also have to come to terms with some of the basic problems affecting the UK as a trading nation. When I was Europe Minister, I used to see the figures for how we were doing in the Far East, or in Latin America, or in Turkey, as against France, Germany, and Italy. All of us were bound by EU rules, same set of rules. But they were doing better than we were. And I remember my officials saying, look, if we could, and trade minister saying to me, if we could raise our game to the average of Germany, France, and Italy, it would be a boost to our trade position and to our GDP. So we need to ask ourselves some hard questions as to why, while we've been in the EU, we haven't been doing as well as some of our big EU competitors, and try to make the changes to raise our game. That takes us back to, I suppose, some of the training and skills, and getting SMEs and big companies to work together in the way that in Germany, for example, they do very successfully.
Right. A question from a gentleman called Niall Finn. What is the point of a quote-unquote binding agreement on state aid if this government is prepared to break its word through UK legislation, David?
I think that there's no doubt that those clauses in the Internal Markets Bill have made life much more difficult for the government. I think it's a self-inflicted wound, and it will harm trust, which is essential if you're in a negotiation with any other country. It's not just going to apply to the EU. I mean, countries all around the world will ask questions about this. Every sovereign country has the power to resile from its international agreements. That doesn't mean it's right or it's wise to do that. They have the power to do it as sovereign states. Most international agreements, whether about trade or other things, have within them dispute resolution mechanisms, and they have exit clauses of some sort. There are some exceptions, but most do have those arrangements. The withdrawal agreement has a dispute resolution mechanism, and the withdrawal agreement has, in Article 16, also, if you like, an emergency parachute, where it says if you are facing economic or societal disruption as a result of the Northern Ireland Protocol, then both the EU and the UK have the right to take emergency unilateral action. And I think the government should have relied on that, not gone for those clauses. So I think it does make life more difficult. But there's no other way in which to do business in the world between sovereign states. Treaties are accepted by the parties to them as mutually binding. Right.
Well, the next question sort of follows on from a gentleman called David Fitzsimons, who's director of the European Remanufacturing Council. And you touched on it before in political terms about new kinds of initiatives to create dialogue. David Fitzsimons' question is, which non-political bridges should we concentrate on to rebuild trust between the EU and UK? That, of course, the premise of the question, of course, is that trust has to be rebuilt. Maybe you should address that first. Do you think there's an issue about that trust needs to be rebuilt between the EU and the UK?
Yeah, yes, trust needs to be rebuilt, and also relationships have inevitably become very bruised. If you go and talk to politicians in most of the rest of Europe, they still find baffling the decision that the British electorate took in 2016. They blame British politicians of all parties for not arguing skillfully enough to stop that happening. And they say, look, why on earth are you doing this at a time when we're under unprecedented pressure from Russia? We've got the rise of an autocratic and increasingly rather aggressive China. We have terrorism and instability in North Africa and the Middle East, and we have a United States that is questioning, to put it mildly, its role as the guarantor of Europe's security and the upholder of a rules-based international order. And yet you're wanting to walk away. You're fragmenting the West. That is their view. So there is going to need to be a lot of work done. I mean, some of this, David says, is you could say completely non-political. I think that will continue. The people-to-people contacts between universities, between scientists, between people in the arts, between businesses. But I think if I can sort of take this as an invitation just to make reference to the slightly sort of more consensual political issues, climate seems to me one key issue. And actually, if you look at what Boris Johnson has said and done on climate and the environment, in practice, he has cleaved pretty closely to the European position. He hasn't gone and followed the White House when it comes to climate. Next year, the UK hosts the COP summit in Glasgow. It's a huge opportunity for Britain outside the EU to demonstrate global leadership and influence. And to do that, we're going to need to work closely with others. So I think that's one big opportunity on that issue. Second opportunity, I would say, is going to be on COVID, obviously at the moment, and continuing to work closely with other European countries on COVID seems to be important, but also counter-terrorism, counter-extremist work. Again, not much notice. One thing that Boris Johnson did of becoming Prime Minister was to continue and reinforce the military commitment that we had made to the French-led initiative in the Sahel to contain terrorism and extremism there. And I think continuing with that sort of work is important. Continuing to work with France and with Germany over Iran is important. Demonstrating continued interest in and a commitment to help resolve the disputes in the Western Balkans and in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, for example, and standing up for human rights in Belarus and democracy in Belarus. Those matter to other European countries, and they matter actually to our interests as well. So I think those are good issues that we need to take forward in demonstrating we're serious about building a new kind of good friendly relationship.
Okay. Before I move to the next question from the audience, there's a lady, Victoria Main, has asked a question, I think of Kelly as much as of you, David, about the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we want a bit of clarity. So Victoria, if you're still watching and listening, could you slightly rephrase your question, put it back in the chat function, and Kelly and or David will do their best to answer it. Next question for you, David, from Daniel Boffey, Brussels Bureau Chief of The Guardian. Obviously, you campaign for Remain, says Daniel. Can you plausibly see any potential benefits for the British economy from Brexit should the deal be struck this year with Brussels?
I think I'm tempted to quote Jacob Rees-Mogg, who said, "We'll only see the benefits of Brexit when we look back after 50 or 60 years." Yes, it'd be stupid to pretend that there can be no benefit, and I think the net to the UK, I think it's a big disadvantage to leave the EU. But there were some things on the other side of the ledger, as the earlier question on Japanese FTA showed you. We could sometimes be perhaps a bit more nimble than if we had to work within the constraints of an EU mandate in getting FTAs. Now, I happen to think that's usually going to be offset by the fact that we'll have less leverage as a country of 65, 70 million people, rather than the EU with us in it, where you were looking at 400 million odd people as a marketplace. So not as much leverage, but perhaps we can be more nimble there. I also think there's some merit in the arguments that in the 21st century, quite a bit of future growth may come from some of the new technologies, whether that is AI, robotics, big data, life sciences, GM. And there is a real risk, it seems to me, that the EU, because it is, in my view, being excessively cautious in how it applies the precautionary principle, is driving those technologies to the United States or to China and out of Europe completely. And I know that one thing that motivates Number 10 is the sense that we don't want to be bound by the European regime on that if we see big commercial opportunities for us. I'm much more skeptical about the idea that we can somehow out-subsidize the Chinese to build our own technology giant. But actually, giving more regulatory freedom to some of those new technologies seems to me to be a good thing.
Okay. A question from Richard Barfield of Richard Barfield Advisory Services. What is your view on the likely implications for the future UK-EU relationship of the likely failure to be ready to operationalize, quote unquote, the Northern Ireland Protocol by the end of this year?
It won't help. I think, though, I think the key thing is, will it be best endeavours? I think that Michael Gove has already said, as regards customs, that he would expect it to take 6 months before, for the UK as a whole, before the new customs arrangements came fully into effect. And what I read into that is that HMRC and DEFRA and Home Office aren't going to be ready. The databases won't have been completed and tested and so on by then. So it doesn't help if it's not already then. But I think the key thing will be, are we being seen to be serious about undertaking our obligations under the protocol? I think if we were to depart from that, that would be very, very serious. And I think that would have a significant destabilizing effect on the politics of Northern Ireland. I've sat in meetings in Newry and Derry and Enniskillen and talked to business people and local councillors and others. And there's no doubt in my mind that not only would disruption on the north-south border cause major problems for business, and it's not just would there be checks, but let's say, for example, you are a milk supplier in Northern Ireland and you send your milk to be processed at a dairy in the south, and if suddenly there is a requirement that you've got to have your milk tested because it can't be certain that it meets EU standards, or your pigs going south all have to be inspected before they can go to the abattoir, what will happen is that your customer, the milk processor in the south or the abattoir in the south, won't take the risk of taking your stuff in if they're not absolutely confident all the legal boxes are ticked. So businesses in Northern Ireland would stand to lose, even if there were not fences and border posts physically there in North South, but also the political impact would be huge. One of the benefits of joint EU membership has been that people in Northern Ireland who think of themselves as Irish basically can grow up, they can live their lives as if the border does not exist and actually say, let sleeping dogs lie. I get some nice things out of the UK NHS, for example, and it doesn't stop me thinking of myself as Irish, and I can drive over to see my auntie in County Monaghan or whatever without any difficulty at all. And as soon as you start saying, well, actually, perhaps that border's got to mean something more, you're touching on issues of identity, and I think you're in trouble there. The number of people who think of themselves as British, the number of people who think of themselves as Irish in Northern Ireland is about equal. It's about 44%, and about 12% in the middle, sort of unaligned. And keeping the union, I'm a very strong unionist, means you've got to hold on to enough unaligned and moderate nationalists who are prepared to say, yeah, this is on balance, just leave things alone. Let's not have a bust up about the constitutional status. And one of the things we saw when there was talk about a real north-south border was some of those moderate nationalists were starting to shift to a more hardline position.
Okay. Another question now from Adam Isaacs, official at the European Parliament. The Swiss referendum last night makes it likely a raft of bilateral sectoral EU-Swiss agreements going to be rolled up under a broader governance structure, says Adam. What does this mean for UK negotiations in the future?
Oh, well, it's been a long-standing objective of the EU to try to bring all of Switzerland's bilateral agreements into a single overarching governance structure, and the Swiss have always resisted that. Now, I'm gonna hold fire on this because yesterday's referendum basically reversed completely the referendum outcome of a few years ago, when the Swiss voted for quotas to be imposed on EU nationals, and the EU had threatened to invoke the guillotine clause that does exist in the current agreements, which would have brought to a halt, a number of the other key agreements between the EU and Switzerland. So, to that extent, that element is already there. I think it would be quite a hard sell in Switzerland to have an overarching governance agreement of the kind that the EU wants to see. But certainly, I mean, what it does, I think, one of the messages it does send, I think, it's probably answer direct to the question is this: that the EU will not want another Switzerland. They will not want to have an agreement with the UK of the kind that the UK government wants to see, where you have completely separate bilateral UK-EU agreements on different areas of policy with no overall architecture between them. So you see this happening in all the discussion about level playing field when it comes to the FTA.
Right.
Some of it will be separate. You can have a policing agreement which isn't dependent on a trade agreement, but I think that I might be perfectly relaxed about an association agreement, but I think the present government probably doesn't want to see that sort of overarching structure.
Okay. We now have clarification from Victoria Main, a question about the Black Lives Matter movement. A question, actually, we're going to bring briefly back in David Kelly to answer this one. So the question to you, Kelly, is on generational differences. What about the Black Lives Matter movement? Does that reinforce opinions one way or another on Brexit?
So not that we've seen, and it's important to recognise that some of the underlying reasons why some individuals did vote to leave the European Union, such as the immigration debate, it still does rank high in the public's priority list, what they want to achieve from Brexit. So that hasn't gone away. What we have seen is a spike in people's concern around race relations in the UK. That has spiked as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement. But it's worth noting that the British public and all of the evidence that we can see, it was not a racism, it was an immigration thing, and that still stands.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Back to you now, David. A question from Richard Whitman, director of the Global Europe Centre, University of Kent. Professor Whitman, I should say. He says the following: HMG decided not to negotiate on foreign security and defence policy cooperation, despite being in the political declaration. How do you see that relationship evolving in this area? I also recommend en passant a very good paper co-authored by Richard from Chatham House on this very issue. So back to you, David.
I was very disappointed when the government took that approach. I hope still that once we get into 2021, so nobody can say that Brexit still hasn't been done. Someone's blocking it, and it's clear that no one can argue with the fact that the UK is a sovereign, independent country. That there will be a willingness to go back and sort of revisit this again in those new legal circumstances. I think that it's very important that we work together with other European countries, whether that is through a formal structured relationship of some kind with the CFSP, CSDP mechanisms, or whether it's more along the lines of some coalitions of the willing, which is where President Macron seems to be approaching this with talk about E3s or European Security Council. Not sure that all the rest of the 27 are too happy with the idea of an E3, and that includes the Germans. Actually, I think not too happy with that, because certainly if it's Donald Trump for second term, and even if it's Joe Biden, I think you'll find that Washington is increasingly saying to the Europeans, both, you need to spend more on your own defence and security, but second, you have the job of taking political leadership and ownership of Western transatlantic activity in some parts of the world. I mean, the US, I think, is going to say, with regard to Africa, well, that's something for you Europeans to sort out. I think they'll want Europe to take the lead on the Western Balkans, and I think they're going to want Europe to take up more of the slack, probably with the Arab world, and to contribute to what the Americans see as something really matters big to them in the Indo-Pacific region, with a Biden or a Trump will focus on China. So while I think Biden, unlike Trump, would be somebody who sees the EU actually as a friend, not as an arch foe, but and who puts a greater value on alliances and international institutions than President Trump does. He's still going to want Europe to do more than it's been comfortable with doing in the past. And so I think a strong UK relationship with the rest of Europe is important for all of our interests. And you can't talk seriously about a coordinated European security policy if the UK and France are not both involved.
Well, let me press you a bit more, if I may, David, on Richard's point about E3, because for the benefit of our audience, I'm sure everybody knows, but let's just remind ourselves it's all about the UK and France and Germany coordinating their positions vis-a-vis Iran in particular. But this paper that Richard has written, co-authored, which I mentioned just now, it talks about that's a good, maybe foundation for the future kind of UK foreign policy post-Brexit. I take your point that maybe the rest of the EU isn't not terribly keen on this, on the EU E3 even existing, and the External Action Service, I think, has made that pretty clear. But from the UK perspective, it is something to try and build on, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and I think that I think that a formalised E3 would be quite difficult to achieve within the EU system. Right. I think Germany would be nervous about something that appears to subvert the existing EU treaty-based structures, and that's Germany, where Angela Merkel is Chancellor, who's pretty forward-leaning in foreign security policy. Now, we don't know who'll succeed her in the CDU, and we don't know what the outcome will be of the Bundestag election next year. It's conceivable you'd have a CDU Green coalition, or even conceivably a Green-led coalition, which might change Germany's stance a bit. But Netherlands, Czech Republic, Sweden, these countries are not going to be comfortable with the idea that somehow France, Germany, and the UK sort of go off and do their own thing. And in practice, France and Germany are going to be taking part in the Foreign Affairs Council decisions in Brussels as well, and contribute to shaping a collective EU position. So the way that Europe works, you can't sort of lock out the EU, whatever criticisms one might make of the effectiveness or otherwise of the External Action Service. So I think we can have to do this. But I do think, while the unanimity rule, which I can't see changing, other possibly at the margins, it means that the EU is likely always to be pretty slow to move as an international player. I think one could look at coalitions of the willing in Europe. That it might be that model that I might see growing up. And you've got things like the European Intervention Initiative that already exists, and perhaps that provides the sort of bridge, not quite E3, but it's not limiting yourself to working with the Foreign Affairs Council and EEAS structures. Okay.
A question from that well-known person, Anon. Is it possible to decouple the free trade agreement from defense and security? Can the EU-UK security cooperation be salvaged from a no deal, or are we just left with only NATO?
Oh, I mean, it's possible. It's possible to decouple the security and defense from the FTA. I think that there'll be some things that even in an acrimonious no deal will continue. I mean, NATO, the questioner mentioned, the cooperation between defense forces, military chiefs is going to continue through NATO. The intelligence relationships are going to continue. Article 4 of the European treaties provides a carve-out from EU competence for matters of national security, although so perhaps a subject for a debate another time about the extent to which the CJEU is trying to define and limit that carve-out. And so that intelligence cooperation will continue. But I think that my experience is that while NATO will remain our primary organization, institution for collective defense, and it's really important because it binds the Americans and the Canadians into the defense of European security. There are things that can be done through CSDP that complement that. Not everything is within the NATO mandate. And so some of the things that European countries are doing in the Sahel, for example, it's not part of NATO's mandate. Involvement of a country like Sweden or Finland that are neutrals, they're not part of NATO. A country like Austria that has a really significant interest in the stability of the Western Balkans and the development of the Western Balkans. But again, a neutral country. Ireland, that is a big contributor to UN peacekeeping operations, but again, neutral, not a NATO member. You can get some value added through the other modes of working with European countries, because it allows you to do things in parts of the world and spheres of activity that are outside the NATO remit. It means you can bring in, if you're looking at people smuggling out of Africa, some of that is about interdicting terrorism, and it's about police. Some of it's about policing. That's not NATO. Some of it's about development aid. That's not NATO. And it's this multidisciplinary opportunity that the broader work can involve you with. And I think that we would be wise to certainly remain very committed to NATO, but to look for other opportunities to broaden our international relationships as well.
We're coming to the last few minutes of our chat, David. Just to remind our audience, if you want to ask a question, now is the moment to do it. Otherwise, it'll be too late. Since you mentioned NATO, I want to ask you the following. The UK government, quite understandably, is quite keen to demonstrate that it's, with or without the global Britain mantra attached to it, it is not shutting itself off from the rest of the world. It is not just a member of NATO, but a very active member of NATO, as you know. It is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. We all know that. It is in the G7, has the presidency of the G7 next year, G20, obviously. And last but not least, maybe there are other examples, co-chairing COP26 next year on climate change. All those things together. Is that a persuasive case for the UK to present to the rest of the world, also to not just to reassert its kind of global aspiration, but also to reassure its friend that it is not closing down?
Yes, I know. We will remain a significant player. We will continue to have one of the largest and most developed economies in the world. We will continue to have one of the most effective armed forces and intelligence services and development aid programs in the world. And we will participate, as you said, in a whole number of international institutions and relationships around the world. The way I look at it is that the UK is and will remain both a European power and a European power which has a global outlook and global interests. And I see those two things as being complementary, not in opposition to one another. And I think that is the way we need to make our case in the future. And that approach, that understanding is what should shape how we seek to develop a relationship with our next door neighbours.
Okay. A question actually from Stephen Castle of the New York Times. He failed to get the chat function to work, but he cheekily sent me an email, which I managed to read while listening to you, David. So Stephen Castle's question is, do you think there has to be another Varadkar moment in the Brexit talks? And if so, with whom? Between Boris Johnson and somebody else?
I think that, my view is that there needs to be senior political engagement at head of government level. The obvious person to do that, I suppose, is Chancellor Merkel, because Germany has the rotating presidency at the moment. It's possible, Emmanuel Macron may possibly fulfill that role. That France and Germany will work very closely together as always. And Macron, because he is one of the hawkish camp of EU leaders on things like level playing field and fisheries, In the sense that if he can do the deal and sort of get to Boris Johnson, say, look, here we both are. What compromise would work for us both, and just have that kind of hypothetical conversation about where if you do this, we might be able to move on that. Does that work, or do you suggest something else? Have that sort of exploratory conversation at senior political level. So could be Merkel, could be Macron, could be the two of them. That's how I would see it work. I think that the two warnings I have, although I do remain just an optimist for a deal. One is we should not underestimate how upset the Germans are by those clauses in the internal markets bill. The rule of law is something that really does matter to them hugely. And secondly, time. That I think there does need to be that senior political engagement, but we're running out of weeks.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you. Well, there have been a number of questions about the Prime Minister today, which I tried to kind of tactically ignore, but they're piling up. They're basically, in a nutshell, how do you explain the Prime Minister's relative level of popularity in the polls, given everything that's going on? Another question from Steve Arlen says, should we have sympathy for the Prime Minister given the twin challenges of COVID and Brexit? What is your view on how the rest of the world perceives the UK currently? What does he see as the work required from a sort of public relations point of view? Basically, our image, I suppose, our image toward the rest of the world.
I think I think I'd have sympathy for anybody who was serving as Prime Minister in current circumstances. You're talking about a pandemic that we haven't seen the like of since immediately after the First World War, and at a time when modern news media means that everybody is aware of what is happening in all its ghastly detail. So I do have sympathy there. I've got it's no secret I have disagreements with the Prime Minister on European policy, but I think my impression, most people in this country, almost regardless of their politics, they desperately want the government's policies to work, certainly when it comes to COVID. And I think that in part has accounted for the British government, like other governments, getting a boost in opinion polls. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that it's still relatively recently that the Prime Minister secured a very impressive electoral mandate. It's less than a year since the general election. And quite often that honeymoon effect does go on for that length of time. And I think equally, though Keir Starmer, I think, has demonstrated to the public that he is not Jeremy Corbyn, and he's clawed back some of Labour's position because of that. I think he's quite away from persuading the electorate that they feel they can see the Labour Party as a convincing government in waiting. So he, from his point of view, he's got a big job of work still to do there. So I think that may explain it helps to explain the polling position. How the rest of the world sees us. First, we shouldn't kid ourselves that they spend ages thinking about us. They've got other things on their plates. Thank you very much, all of them. And even look at Europe. If you read the priorities document published by the German presidency, there is one mention of Brexit. It is on page 21, between the paragraph on the United States and the paragraph on China. And talk to any politician from another EU country, with the possible exception of Ireland, and they will say, look, we're worried about COVID. We're worried about getting the COVID recovery plan approved by the European Parliament, getting that sorted and finalized. We're worried about Russia. We're worried about there's still something fragile political and banking situation in Italy. We're worried about what's going to happen in the United States elections. We're increasingly concerned about China and what they're up to. Look, frankly, you took your decision 4 years ago. We're a bit fed up with waiting around for you to decide what you lot want. Come and tell us when you're ready. And I think they are not agonizing over Brexit. If you read French and German or even Irish newspapers, they are not consumed by stories about Brexit. so they've got, and that applies in spades if you're going to China or Nigeria or Mexico somewhere. I think outside Europe, I think they're a bit bemused by Brexit. I think most countries probably think, well, seems a bit crazy. Why walk out of a big single market where you have preferential trade access to all these important countries? But they don't really understand or that interested in the detail of it. They think, in the big scheme of things, it'll be sorted out. And again, compared with the erosion of a rules-based international trading order, growing US-China tension, the way in which digital technology is shaking up professional and white-collar work and completely transforming expectations about employment for future generations. Climate change, the need to go to net zero carbon. Those are the big issues. Zoonotic diseases. Brexit is a regional difficulty that's happening over there somewhere, and we employ these diplomats to think about that. Most people in the world don't know or care all that much about it.
Okay, we're going to squeeze in one quick final question about the Prime Minister, David. Okay, from Will Hutton, Observer columnist, co-chair of the Salvaged company, who asked the following: how ready do you judge the Parliamentary Conservative Party is to support the Prime Minister through a no-deal Brexit?
I think that there will be some who will be sort of pretty ideological about this, who will actually want to see that happen. I think that a lot of Conservative MPs, again, don't exaggerate how many Conservative MPs follow Brexit or have followed European debates in any detail. When I was Europe Minister, one of the things I found frustrating was whenever there was a Europe debate, it was the same old familiar cast of characters every single time. One side I'd have Bill Cash and John Redwood and Steve Baker and Christopher Chope, and on the other side there was Ken Clarke and Dominic Grieve and Oliver Letwin and so on. And it was all I could have sat there and written their speeches for them for the most part, because it was all eminently predictable. Very few new arguments, and a lot of MPs, they're focusing on the health service or universal credit or agricultural policy or tax policy or housing. And I think that what they will look at is what is happening in their constituencies. And I think that will have an impact on them, as if, you're a Kent MP and you suddenly find your constituents complaining because the roads are gummed up and they've got, umpteen lorries sort of queuing. Or if you have people starting to complain about supermarket prices going up because the European food is either being tariffed or is in relatively short supply because of disruption at the ports. And if you start getting firms going under and attribute or shedding jobs and attributing that to Brexit rather than to COVID or anything else, that I think starts to get any MP rather concerned.
All right. Next question, more for information. So if you give a quick answer, if you have the answer to the question, David. Do all the UK's aid and trade relations with 70+ African, Caribbean, Pacific countries have to be renegotiated?
I haven't got that to hand. I wouldn't want to give a misleading answer without checking that.
We'll move on then. Sorry, Mr. Anon or Mrs. Anon. The final question before I wrap up is from Georgina Wright, a senior researcher at the Institute for Government. She says, asked the following: Brexit will change the UK, but will also change the EU. In Sir David's experience, where did the UK add value to the EU, and where would it be in the EU's interest for the UK to remain close? Very good question, Georgina.
I think the risk is that with the UK's absence, the EU will become more protectionist. We've always been one of those championing open markets and free trade. And secondly, I think that there is a risk the EU will become more cautious in terms of foreign policy positions. And I think the UK's role as a bit of a bridge to North America, but also sitting there with France as a country with both a global outlook and network of interest and a willingness to use diplomatic aid and military resource to pursue global objectives. That we were contributing something there that it's going to be difficult to make up through other countries. And I think that the EU will very much miss us on the security and foreign policy work. What we've had is the EU has lost a huge proportion of its diplomatic capability, its potential military capability, and its aid capability. And I think the more free market countries in the EU will, well, they say, they will miss us. And some of them, you're seeing this with the Netherlands in particular at the moment. They are having to become more willing to stick their heads above the parapets over things like budget discipline. Whereas almost every British minister had the experience of sitting in a council meeting, one configuration or another, and being almost on your own, sometimes arguing with the French and Germans on a particular issue. And at the end of the day, you'd have a number of ministers from smaller countries come. So I'm so glad you said that. You do understand why I couldn't actually say in the room that I agreed with you on this. And actually, so there'll be our absence will affect the balance and of interest and the willingness of others to actually decide whether they take a stand on something.
Okay, we have to leave it there. It's been fascinating. My thanks to you, Sir David. My thanks to Kelly Beaver at Ipsos Mori for doing the fabulous presentation, doing that wonderful research for us. My thanks to my wonderful colleagues at Forum Europe who put all this together. I just sit here and ask the questions. The message to the audience, as much as to the people on the call, on the panel, if you like what you see, do get in touch. If you'd like to become a member of the forum, you'll go to our website. As I said, the slides of Kelly's presentation will be available on her website as well as our website. You'll see details of our future events on the website, such as they have already been identified. But if you want to suggest ideas and speakers and moderators, all that for future events, all you've got to do is drop me an email. It is as easy as that. So without further ado, all I want to do is again thank David and Kelly, and wish you all, the rest of you watching this discussion, a very good day. See you next time.